we were talking about India, and now we can turn our attention to China a bit more. And we brought China into the picture as India's big neighbour with the biggest population in the world, well over 1 billion. And there has been somewhat of a rivalry between India and China, including the flashpoint of the 1962 border war, which seemed to be of historical significance. Now China faces India kind of faces the Indian Ocean, but China is looking out to the Pacific. And it sees itself as a great power, which it is. It has been on the rise. And its rise has been astonishingly fast. And it's considered a rival to the USA as the Pacific hegemon. Now, in a good world order, there needs to be good relations between these two powers so that there is peace and stability and security, not just for the Asian Pacific region, but for the whole world. China has had to deal with the West. We talked about how the British precipitated the Opium Wars, which is not something that the West can really be proud of, but it led to the Treaty of Nanking and the ceding of Hong Kong to the British. And that became a really important colonial trading outpost. But China, of course, has undergone a revolution. The long centuries of emperors, different empires, and then in the 20th century, we see the last emperor come along around, 1911, I think, was the end of his reign. And then after that, we see the rise of a struggle between forces which were going to determine the political destiny of China. In particular, we see the clash between the nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek and the revolutionary forces led by Mao Zedong. And in the end, of course, it was Mao's revolution which brought communism to China in 1949. 1st of October was the official starting date of that regime. Now, communism. In theory, communism was meant to be a worldwide project of conquest. In Trotsky's view, it automatically led to a kind of imperialism or international outreach because it wasn't about any particular nation state. This ideology cut across nation states. So that line of thought would say that the working class in, say, Russia and Germany had more in common with each other than they had allegiances to their respective countries, Russia and Germany. But in practice, communism never really turned into that kind of international revolutionary open movement. Perhaps you could say that it was a covert movement during the Cold War, but so often it became easier to canalize the forces of revolution within a single state. Like Stalin wanted communism in one country, in the Soviet Union. So it was more the consideration was more to shore up the gains of the revolution within one people or within one jurisdiction, rather than perpetually being at war with every oppressive class everywhere else on the globe. And something similar happened in China, which in its early days, as a communist country, was under the tutelage of the Soviet Union, but then moved in its own direction. But Mao kept the country closed and tightly controlled. And with the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s, rapid industrialisation, and then you had the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, which was a purge of a lot of the elements that were not considered to be ideologically pure. And then through all this period, China was more inward looking. It was concerned with the problems of the Chinese and putting down roots with the new system. But Mao dies in 76, and then Deng Xiaoping comes to power. And he does something quite extraordinary in the sense of opening China up, liberalising it, and changing its economy so that it is socialism with Chinese characteristics, but it exhibits a lot of the traits of a free market economy, and then China is able to trade with the world more openly, and it is able to liberalise its economy. In other words, it's not all state ownership, but it's a combination of state and private ownership, in order to generate the wealth that has been needed by its vast population. And these reforms have lifted millions and millions out of poverty, and China is generally recognised to be an economic miracle in that regard, in a slightly different way from which the Asian tigers are considered to be economic miracles. But they're post-World War II, under Western, particularly American influences. They've really ramped up their economies and focus so much of their energy and aspiration on economic growth. You know, South Korea and Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan. But with China, it really had to open up to the rest of the world before this growth could take place. And that's why in the early 70s, the diplomatic efforts of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger and so on, who, of course, America's national interest, it was thought that the best thing for American security was to try and reach out to China and have a relationship happening so that China wouldn't ever be able to get too close to the Soviet Union. In other words, exploit the tensions and disagreements between China and the Soviet Union, bring China closer to America, and in that would be a security of sorts. And around this time too, maybe even slightly earlier than, Nixon and Kissinger were going to China, our Prime Minister in Australia, Gough Whitlam, made a trip to China as well. So by the early 70s, by 71, China was ready to talk to the West. And some of that tension started to thaw, and instead of seeing China as the yellow peril to the north and the communist menace, this part of the world, the Asia Pacific, realised that it had to begin to come to terms with China without disrespecting China. That China was a great nation, And now it's bidding fair to be a world hegemon. It definitely likes the idea under Xi Jinping of becoming the leader of the world in many respects. And China has wanted to enter into the community of nations and is part of the United Nations and is the biggest donor to the United Nations. And it pays on time. Now, if you open to China, you've got to be able to trust China. And so the peace of the world depends on having a fair and balanced view of China. So often, the fears and insecurities are whipped up in the media, that the Chinese are spying on us, that they are breaching our cyber security, that there's surveillance, that there's infiltration, that they send people to infiltrate the educational institutions.
Look at their own system, Thomas.
Well, there are two basic fears of China that haunt the Western consciousness, which we have to come to terms to. And one is this: they're infiltrating, they're spying, they're stealing technology. Absolutely. And so on. That's one. The other is the treatment of minorities within China. In particular, I would mention Falun Gong and the Uyghurs, the Uyghur Muslims and so on. But it is hard for Christians to practice in China too, because for a Christian always God will be above Caesar and the secular power cannot be worshipped as supreme. It's very hard for the Chinese Communist Party to see religious icons up, and it's very hard for them to tolerate allegiances to a religious ideal or a spiritual ideal over and above, the worship of the state apparatus and the ideals of the revolution.
That's all it is.
And now it's overlaid on the ideals of the revolution are the philosophies of Xi Jinping, Xi's thought, right?
I kind of like the guy, but...
Now, amid all this suspicion, there's massive military preparations going on. And Taiwan is always in the news because that could be the flashpoint. That could bring about war between China and the USA. And I think there's unfortunately been at too great a level of hostility and suspicion towards China in this country, in the United States, and so on. Can you imagine how it would be if the tables were turned and there was the Chinese fleet or some Asian fleet were off the coast of California, let's say? The United States wouldn't tolerate that for a moment. But the Chinese are expected to be ringed around and hemmed in by alliances and by fleets of foreign powers close to its borders. It's a wonder it hasn't lost its nerve up to this point. It's a wonder that it has handled the situation quite stably. And we must not expect the Chinese to see the world in the way that we do. I think it's unrealistic. I think it is counter to peace making to see the Chinese as an enemy that has to be controlled. To become friends with China without losing your autonomy, you need to appreciate the essence of the country. Now, we talked about the religious heritage of India. Yes, there have been things overlaid that have come from outside, including socialist ideas and so on. But that the roots of India are found in the native religions. And in China, the native religions, well, some wouldn't style them religions, but they're certainly ways of life and practice and philosophies. Confucianism and Taoism. And the Chinese leadership, especially Xi, is trying to find the commonalities between their communist ideology and the traditions of Confucianism and Taoism. I mean, Buddhism has come to China too, but it was an export. But these are homegrown, the Confucianism and the Taoism. And a central theme of it all would seem to be social harmony. We in the West, and that's such a problematic term, isn't it, the West, a term begging for a definition, which we don't have time to give, but we'll just hang a few thoughts on that term. We value liberty, individuality, creativity, innovation, doing your own thing. But in China, they value social cohesion and social harmony and deference and respect for elders and authority. Historically, the bureaucracy in China had to take an elaborate exam in Confucianism. They had to understand that system of thought, which was quite hierarchical, and everybody had their place in society. The father's place could not be taken by the mother or the child. Everybody knew their place around the table, and it was the same with society, with the emperor at the center of society. And China at the center of its sphere of influence. That's why it was called the Middle Kingdom. It's smack bang in the middle. And in a sense, in their world conception, in their conception of world order, historically, the Middle Kingdom received tribute from its satellite peoples, its satellite states. China seemed to have a mandate to govern from heaven. It was to rule the whole world, the whole known world. It didn't see itself as one state amongst many. So you've got some of this operating in the background today, and I think we're seeing a revival of it with Xi Jinping's global aspirations and ambitions. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying it's in the Chinese DNA, so we need to understand this center of the universe, global governance aspiration. We can see it in the Belt and Road Initiative, this great investment in infrastructure and transport and trade, spanning the continents, right into Europe and Africa and into the Pacific and so on, funded by Chinese money. We can see it as the statesmanship of China and its all of its pronouncements and positions within the United Nations and on the world stage. And it does go back to this Confucian ideal of a hierarchically organised world. China at the top of the hierarchy and at the centre of things. Now, Confucianism, as I suggested, inculcated great respect for one's elders, for the family unit, and for society and everything being run in a well-ordered way, and for people to respect their elders and their rulers and so on. But when we go to the other great tradition of Taoism, we see a bit of a convergence as well. The Tao is the eternal way. It is the principle, the fundamental basis and reality of the universe. In the West we have the Logos, but in China they have the Tao. The Tao is present everywhere, and it's the Tao that determines all things. And if you're in flow with the Tao, you're basically aligned with providence. But if you're not in flow with the Tao, D-A-T-A-O, although it's pronounced Tao, if you're not in moving with the Tao, then there's going to be frustration in the individual and in the family, and there's going to be disorder in the state. Now, as the Tao moves, it reveals a masculine and a feminine polarity in the yin and the yang. And everybody is familiar with the symbol of the yin and the yang. The yin is the dark and the yang is the light. And in the middle of the yang, there's a spot of yin, and in the middle of the yin, there's a spot of yang, because the masculine and the feminine principles are never totally separable. And from this understanding of this universal energy, the Tao, and its polarity in the yin-yang, come so much of Chinese culture, including their healing arts. People who practice, traditional Chinese medicine and herbalism, they have to understand that. It's present in the martial arts, it's present in their spirituality, and so on. And the I Ching is a set of, it's a tool of philosophy and divination. It's a set of patterns of energy, 64 hexagrams. And again, within the hexagrams, there's ordering, because there is an order to the movement of this Tao. It is not without order, and it's not without structure, and it's not without hierarchy. And the components of the hexagrams in the I Ching make reference to family membership. And there's a place on the table where the father sits, and there's a place on the table where the mother sits, and there's a place for the eldest son and for the eldest daughter, and there's a place for the middle son and the middle daughter, and there's a place for the youngest son and the youngest daughter, and everybody knows their place. That's how harmony is established and social cohesion. We see the dark side of all of these aspirations for social cohesion. We see the nightmarish scenario of the surveillance state that the Chinese seem to be pushing for. And we say, we don't want that kind of, communist surveillance apparatus at work where we live. But there is a positive side to the Chinese aspiration for social cohesion. We see it as a repression of individuality sometimes. But the Chinese, know that too much competition, unbridled competition, can lead to strife. If we don't like something, we say, stuff you, I'm going to go my own way. Chinese don't like to do that. We don't mind our conflicts being more overt, but the Chinese prefer to avoid conflict and maintain outward harmony. That's why saving face is such a big thing in the Chinese culture. So we have to understand these differences. Competition versus cooperation. Conflict, openly ventilated to be dealt with, versus cohesion. And the Chinese leadership, especially Xi, keep banging on about international cooperation and a world order that is good for everybody. And they accent cooperation a lot more than competition. Whereas in the United States, we saw Donald Trump's rise to power. And part of it was his ability to represent China as a huge competitor. And no doubt it will continue to be as he continues on his second ascendancy towards the presidency. If we don't have a balanced view of China and don't have an open heart and an open mind and an intention for friendship and appreciation of their culture and a cross-cultural pollination, we're just going to go crazy. We've got this AUKUS deal going now with the submarines and these plans to, use submarine patrols and have nuclear powered submarines come into our ports and come into other ports and contain China and prepare Taiwan and make sure that we're ready to go to its defence. And the US is, in some cases, doing overtly provocative actions, like when Nancy Pelosi went over to Taiwan, because Taiwan is critical, and it's critical, among other things, for its semiconductors, which are needed in all our computer systems. But Taiwan, the mainland China sees as part of itself, as an extension of itself, but Taiwan is very jealous of its freedoms, which they, like liberal democracy, they want to be a parliamentary democracy on the Western model. So there's this tension between competition and cooperation, the Chinese view of the world and the Western view of the world, the emphasis on rivalry versus harmony and so on, the emphasis on local autonomy and individuality, including individuality of region, versus an all-comprehensive empire. We see this, all of these tensions playing out between China and Taiwan, and the West seems to have a vested interest in protecting Taiwan's protection of its own way of life. And it's been an interesting experiment. One nation, two systems sort of idea. I don't know if everybody, and certainly not everybody in the mainland, nor everybody in Taiwan would look at it that way. But it is a potential flashpoint, just as the Middle East has been, and it's gone off, in fact, in the Middle East. It's gone off in the Ukraine. These are other flashpoints, and Taiwan is another one that the strategists are looking at. But the point that I have been making, and that I want to end up on, is this: that there's a positive side to the rise of China. There's even a positive side to its historical consciousness of universal hegemon. China can bring development and prosperity to the Pacific and to other regions as well. We need to allow China to play its part. We need to partner up with China and help each other to make a better world. And that takes a certain kind of commitment and a certain kind of consciousness. And if we're continually mistaking this Chinese love of harmony, the balancing of the yin-yang, and social cohesion and so on for just oppressive totalitarianism, we're not going to get there. We need to be clear about religious freedom, number one. We need to be clear about that. We need to be clear and outspoken about protecting religious freedom wherever we find it. Amongst the Tibetan Buddhists, amongst the Uyghurs, amongst the Christians in China, and make it clear to China the sort of people that we are. But there's a difference between affirming your own identity as a nation or a culture and demonising China. And to demonise China would be to imperil the security not only of the Asia Pacific region but of the world. So let's hope we don't do that.